The challenge of every obstetrician, midwife, anyone who attends birth is to recognize that not every pregnancy will become an infant, and that is a biologic reality.
I found out I was pregnant, and in my early second trimester, found out that the baby had multiple fatal anomalies that meant he wasn't going to survive.
One of the most challenging aspects of practicing in obstetrics and gynecology is that we see some of the happiest times in a woman's life, and we also see some of the saddest. And early on, it was apparent to me that how we care for that patient in that moment of real trial is so critical to their health and future.
They delivered incredibly devastating news, and in the same breath said that I had no options in Texas, and that even though my baby wasn't going to live and could die in my womb at any moment, that no one had yet been criminalized for leaving the state to end a pregnancy.
Let's be clear about what the law is in Texas. Only a physician may perform an abortion, and that physician may only perform an abortion if he or she determines in the exercise of reasonable medical judgment that the woman has a life-threatening physical condition that either puts her at risk of death or at substantial risk of impairment of a major bodily function.
So the heartbeat bill is what we think of as Senate Bill 8, or the chapter in the code that creates a civil cause of action where people could sue someone who helped a person get an abortion that didn't comply with the requirements that a heartbeat not be detected in the pregnancy before the abortion was performed. The trigger ban is called that because it was not triggered and did not go into effect until the Supreme Court overturned Roe in the Dobbs case. So it is the felony criminal abortion ban with the severe civil penalties that the Attorney General can bring also.
Did we think then, after all the years that Roe versus Wade, that it would be done away with in Texas? No. In 2004, when I was elected, never occurred to us that would happen. To most people that I knew of, we're going to work with the law that we could. The overarching fact in that debate was that Roe versus Wade was legal. And then people were just finding ways, how can we chip away with the availability and convenience and things like that. Certification of abortion clinics, availability of admission privileges for doctors. And then we started doing a couple of things that people hadn't done before. The trigger bill that basically said, if Roe versus Wade is ever repealed, this bill goes into effect, but until that time, it's absolutely worthless.
In 2021, in anticipation of possible action by the Supreme Court, the Texas legislature passed both SB 8, or the Heartbeat Act, and the trigger law. And SB 8 had an immediate effect, and I think was covered nationally because it posed a lot of new legal issues with respect to standing challenges to the law, which meant that it wasn't immediately put on hold by a court, and there was a lot of uncertainty about whether or not that would impact the delivery of health care. Once the trigger law took effect, Texas has now several prohibitions in various statutes against abortion. They don't all have the exact same wording. There are no exceptions for rape and incest. And there is still uncertainty about whether the laws that were struck down by Roe are still in effect.
Women risk their life with every pregnancy. So if you have 100,000 women in the room, one room here and 100,000 over here, and they're all pregnant, more women in the room with the pregnancies are going to die in the next year than the women with no pregnancies. At any age group, any race, economic identifier, that is a reality. So when they pass a law that says it's up to the physician to decide, is there a risk of death? She's pregnant, there is a risk of death.
1 in 4 pregnancies end in abortion. a spontaneous abortion, an inevitable abortion, an incomplete abortion, and a lot of septic abortions since 2021. Probably we know now what septic abortions are, but in case we don't, they are when a uterine lining becomes infected because the membranes have ruptured and there's now easy access for bacteria into the uterine cavity. What was a protected and sterile space is now infected, and the only cure is delivery. Graphically, when that infection of the uterine lining occurs and the patient, the person who is pregnant, gets a fever, her white count goes up and she starts to lose blood pressure and heart rate gets fast. And this is a negative feedback loop, and it's just like circle in the drain. So eventually organ failure and death. And from overwhelming sepsis. In a situation like this, babies can't live. If the mother is so infected that she is dying, the baby is, by definition, dying too.
One of the scenarios that I think is the best to kind of define how women are hurt. I have a patient who is very public in her story. It's been in other news stories, where she had a pregnancy that was strongly desired. She'd done multiple rounds of in vitro fertilization to create this life. And I remember this day. I walked in a 12-week ultrasound and had to tell her this baby had very rare numerous malformations that were incompatible with life. It's a 1 in 100,000 scenario. But in Texas, she has no right to do anything. So I can't even talk to her about options, because, we're also fearful of, this aiding and abetting sort of situation. Thankfully, my patients are sophisticated. She knew her rights, and she knew that she had the right to travel to a different state. But that takes time, right? Our neighboring states are overwhelmed with other Texans in this scenario. So she traveled to Colorado, and by the time she got in, it was 17 weeks. There's a very rare placental problem called an accreta, where the placenta actually invades through the uterus. She had her procedure done, not in a hospital, but in a center that deals with this, and immediately had life-threatening hemorrhage or bleeding out. And they had to, in a private vehicle, take her emergently to the major hospital, where she was at risk of, losing her life, losing her uterus. And she had a procedure done emergently called an artery embolization, which thankfully stopped the blood flow and, thankfully saved her uterus and her life. But she saw a high-risk specialist that I trust implicitly in this town, who actually told her she should never have pregnancy again because the risk of future pregnancy after this condition is high. So here's a scenario of a woman who, had a risk to her and had a condition that she probably would not have had, because if she had the ability to have this termination in Texas at 13, 14 weeks, that placental problem would have never happened. And if she never had this procedure, even at 17 weeks, if she carried this baby to term, the treatment of that condition is hysterectomy.
Where things seem to have gotten more complicated recently is end of life. Those babies who are not going to be viable or whose continued gestation are going to cause serious health risks to the mother.
Fetal anomalies historically has been an indication for abortion. If you know the infant will die in the delivery room because the fetus has a condition that you can diagnose and you know what's going to happen, historically that has been an indication for abortion. It's currently against the law in the state of Texas.
To care for a patient that's carrying a fetus that you know ultimately will die is truly heartbreaking. Every time that patient comes in the door, you know that there's a chance that that fetus may have lost the heartbeat, which in some situations may even be a small mercy for that patient. But for a patient that carries to term, you know that that patient is dealing with not only the physical implications of being pregnant, but also the emotional distress of walking around the grocery store with everybody in public knowing that that person is pregnant, asking the same questions they would of any pregnant patient that they see. And it just adds insult to injury. To have a patient like that come to deliver a baby that you know is going to die is especially heartbreaking. I have the privilege of having held hands with patients that have been in that situation before. To see a patient deliver a full-term baby that will then suffocate and die in their arms is a pain that I don't wish everybody has to see to understand why access to abortion is so important.
Let's say my patient has an anencephalic fetus, a fetus without a brain. This fetus will not survive after delivery. Everyone knows that. So, currently, that patient has to carry that baby until she goes into labor, deliver that baby, and see that baby die in front of her. For some women, that may be the right answer. That may be the right way to deal with the grief that she will feel. For others, that may be the source of PTSD for the rest of their lives and affect not only future childbearing, but their relationship with their partner. That's a devastating thing. That woman should be able to make that choice, not our legislator.
When I was first married, I got pregnant with a very much desired pregnancy. Unfortunately, I was diagnosed with trisomy 18, which is not compatible with life for the fetus. The fetus was diagnosed with trisomy 18, and I had to make a decision about whether or not to terminate the pregnancy. Ultimately, I decided, with support from my husband and my church, that I was very engaged with and part of a strong Catholic community, to not terminate the pregnancy. And ultimately, I went to full term 9 months and gave birth to a fetus that did not live. The baby was stillborn. It was a choice that I made. By the grace of God, I had support. It was a moment that changed me forever, and I don't regret the decision I made. What I do regret is that there are women, all women who face this in the future because of the extreme abortion ban, will not have that choice to make. They will not have the opportunity to figure out what's right for them, to figure out their path, their faith path, right? And their path for their family, because government has already made the decision and compel women to go to full term 9 months for a fetus that will not live, that is terminal.
I'm Christian. I have friends who are Christian. I have a neighbor who's a devout Catholic, and my daughter loves her. And I remember the first thing she said to me was, "But I don't understand. I don't believe in abortion, but I don't understand why they can't help you."
I'm aware that people are saying that doctors should be able to figure this out. But what you need to understand is that there's not a law in the state of Texas about abortion care. There are a handful of laws that impact abortion care for women and impose various degrees of potential criminal and civil liability, as well as adverse action by the Texas Medical Board. All of those taken together are hard to interpret. And when people point to, oh, there's an exception for medical necessity, there's an exception for emergencies or critical aspects without the specific law of the statute in front of me, I'd be hard-pressed to respond on exactly what that means. And even with the specific language of the statute in front of me, people can differ in interpretation. The problem for the physicians trying to provide this care is that they are potentially liable for civil and criminal liability, loss of license, and imprisonment. So what are they going to do?
I have a voting record that is very solidly pro-life. I have some real problems with abortions. But do I think the best remedies are to threaten women and doctors with imprisonment? No, I don't think that's the case.